Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world, because tonight's story begins in a house that looked ordinary from the street, yet held nearly 40 years of sacrifice, silence, and love too heavy for its own walls. By the time Margaret Hale turned 68, she had learned that a house could remember things people tried to forget. The two-story home stood on a quiet street lined with maple trees in a fading suburb outside Cleveland, the kind of neighborhood where children once rode bicycles until the porch lights came on, and where people used to leave their doors unlocked without thinking twice. The paint on the Hale house had begun to peel along the shutters, and one of the front steps leaned slightly to the right, but the place still carried a stubborn dignity. It had endured winter storms, summer blackouts, broken appliances, slammed doors, whispered arguments, and the long, aching years that reshape a family without ever asking permission. Margaret stood in the kitchen one chilly October morning, her cardigan wrapped tightly around her thin frame, staring at the kettle before it began to whistle. The wallpaper behind the stove was old, patterned with tiny blue flowers that she had once chosen because they reminded her of the apron her mother used to wear. She had meant to replace it years ago, but life, as it always had, found a way of becoming more urgent than beauty. From the dining room came the familiar cough of her husband, Daniel. It was a dry, stubborn cough, the kind that seemed to come from deep inside the body, from a place worn down by decades of labor and unspoken strain. Margaret closed her eyes for half a second before pouring hot water into his mug. "Tea," she called softly. "Not coffee. The doctor said no more coffee after 8. From the other room, Daniel answered with the same old humor that had somehow survived everything else. "Then tell the doctor to mind his own business." Margaret almost smiled. "The doctor is trying to keep you alive." "And you've been trying to do that since 1979, Daniel said. She carried the mug to him. He was seated at the table beneath the window, wearing a gray flannel shirt and a pair of reading glasses low on his nose. Time had narrowed him. There had once been a broadness to Daniel Hale, the kind that filled doorways and made children feel safe. Now his shoulders bent inward, and his fingers seemed stiffer each year. But there was still something commanding in his face. Not loudness, not pride, just the hard-earned gravity of a man who had spent his life carrying more than anyone had ever fully seen. He took the mug from her carefully. "Thank you." "You're welcome." For a moment they sat in silence, the kind that comes only after decades of marriage. Outside, the wind pushed a scatter of leaves across the front yard. Margaret looked at him and saw not only the man in front of her, but every version of him that had come before. The 26-year-old factory worker who had shown up on their first date in a borrowed jacket because he was embarrassed his best one had oil stains on the sleeve. The young father who once slept in his work clothes on the couch because he was too tired to undress after taking a double shift. The husband who had stood in this very kitchen 38 years ago, holding rolled blueprints in his hands and saying, "It's small, and it's going to take everything we've got, but one day this house will mean security." Security. What a beautiful word that had sounded like back then. Margaret had been 29 and still carried her teacher training books in a cardboard box, telling herself she would return to school once things got easier, but easier never arrived. Victor was born first, red-faced and hungry and loud enough to wake the dead. 2 years later came Elise, with her pale curls and delicate lungs that made every winter feel like a threat. Noah arrived 7 years after that, a surprise child who entered a family already tired, already stretched, already held together by routines and postponed dreams. The house had grown around those years like bark around an old wound. They had bought it when interest rates were cruel and hope was cheap. Daniel took extra shifts at the machine plant. Margaret cleaned church offices in the evenings and mended neighbors' clothes for cash. There were winters when they kept the thermostat so low that the children wore socks to bed. There were summers when Daniel repaired the roof himself because hiring help was out of the question. More than once, Margaret had stood in the grocery store, silently putting things back on the shelf, doing arithmetic in her head while pretending she had simply changed her mind. But the house remained. It was never elegant. The banister was scratched by moving boxes and children's toys. The basement smelled faintly of damp cardboard. One bathroom sink never drained properly. Yet every inch of it had been purchased by effort. Every room had a story. Victor took his first steps in the living room, staggering toward Daniel while Margaret cried and laughed at the same time. Elise had once fallen asleep beneath the dining room table while Margaret baked bread, because she refused to nap anywhere else. Noah, quiet and serious from the beginning, used to sit on the back steps with a flashlight and a library book long after sunset, until Daniel finally carried him inside. From the outside, the Hale children had grown into success. Victor, now 42, wore expensive watches and talked about expansion, acquisitions, and market timing as though life itself were a bourne room. He had Daniel's jawline, but none of his softness. Even as a teenager, Victor had hated anything that made him feel ordinary. He used to say, "I'm not staying in this neighborhood forever," with a tone that made the place sound like a punishment. Elise, 40, had inherited Margaret's eyes and none of her restraint. Beautiful, poised, and socially skilled, she learned early how to make an impression. As a child, she cried if her dresses were too plain. As a woman, she carried herself like someone constantly standing under a spotlight. Margaret loved her fiercely, but never quite knew how to reach her once appearances began to matter more than tenderness. Noah, the youngest at 33, had once been the easiest child to love and the hardest to understand. Sensitive where Victor was sharp, inward where Elise was theatrical, he spent much of his youth trying not to take up too much space. He had been closest to Margaret in childhood, following her from room to room with questions in his dark eyes, but something changed in him as he grew older. Quiet disappointments accumulated, words went unsaid. Distance set in so gradually that by the time Margaret noticed it, it had already become part of who he was. That was the tragedy of a family, she often thought. Not the shouting, not even the betrayals. It was how slowly people could drift while still calling themselves close. Daniel sipped his tea and glanced toward the hallway that led to his study. "You going in there again today?" Margaret asked. "For a little while." "You should rest." "I rest too much, I'll die of boredom before anything else gets me." She gave him a look. "Must you joke like that?" Daniel softened. "Sorry." The study had always been his private kingdom. Not because he was a cold man, but because everyone in the house needed one room where the noise could not follow. It was a narrow room with built-in shelves, an old desk scarred by years of use, and a brass lamp Margaret had given him on their 15th anniversary. The children were never forbidden from entering, but they understood instinctively that their father kept certain parts of himself there: receipts, papers, notebooks, and thoughts he could not say aloud in the middle of family life. Margaret had stopped trying to organize the room years ago. That afternoon, after Daniel retreated there with a stack of documents and his reading glasses, Margaret stood in the hallway, listening to the low creak of his chair. The sound comforted her. Even now, after all the years, she still listened for him the way some people listened for rain. She turned toward the living room, where sunlight fell across old framed photographs on the mantel. There they all were. Victor in a high school graduation gown, chin lifted like he had already outgrown the town. Elise, at 16, in a pale blue dress, smiling for the camera while secretly angry that the event had not been grand enough. Noah holding a fishing rod beside Daniel at age 11, neither of them smiling, both of them looking strangely peaceful. Margaret picked up another frame, one of herself and Daniel when they were young. She was wearing a cheap white blouse, and he had his arm around her shoulders. They looked poor. They looked exhausted. They looked happy in a way only the young can be when they still believe sacrifice always leads somewhere clean. The phone rang. She set the frame down and answered it. "Mom?" It was Elise. Margaret leaned against the wall. "Hello, sweetheart." "You sound tired." "I am tired. You should let someone help you more." Margaret smiled faintly at the familiar phrasing. Concern first, agenda later. "I manage." There was a pause. "How's Dad today?" "Same as yesterday." Another pause. Then Elise said carefully, "Victor's coming by this weekend. He said maybe we should all have a conversation soon, just to prepare, for whatever comes." Margaret's fingers tightened around the receiver. "Your father is still here." "I know that, Mom. I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." Elise lowered her voice. "I'm only saying people need plans." After they hung up, Margaret remained still for a long moment. Plans. She had spent her entire adult life living inside other people's plans. Daniel's work schedule, the children's tuition, the mortgage, illnesses, emergencies, delays, promises. She could not remember the last time she had made a plan just for herself. That evening, Noah stopped by without warning. He stood on the porch in a dark jacket, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a paper bag from the bakery downtown. "Brought bread," he said. Margaret's face softened immediately. "Come in." He entered with the hesitant air of someone who still belonged there but no longer knew how to act like it. Daniel called from the living room. "That you, boy?" Noah let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a relief. "Yeah, Dad, it's me." At dinner, the conversation stayed gentle, circling harmless topics: the weather, a neighbor's broken fence, a football game no one cared much about. But Margaret noticed the glances: Noah toward Daniel's trembling hand when he lifted his fork, Daniel toward Noah when the younger man looked away too quickly. There was history there, unfinished and sore, but not yet ready to be named. When Noah left, Daniel remained seated at the table long after the dishes had been cleared. "He worries too much," he said at last, meaning Elise. "I dried a plate with slow, even movements. Victor hides it better, but he worries too." Daniel gave a tired hum. "Victor worries about control." Margaret did not answer. "And Noah," Daniel said more quietly, "worries about things he won't say." That made her stop. She turned toward him. "You sound as though you understand them better than I do." Daniel looked down at his hands. "Maybe I understand where they went wrong." Margaret waited, but he said nothing more. Late that night, when the house had fallen quiet and the upstairs pipes gave their old familiar knock, Margaret woke and found Daniel's side of the bed empty. She slipped on her robe and followed the narrow band of light beneath the study door. When she opened it, Daniel was standing by the bookshelf, one hand braced against the wood. "Daniel?" He turned too quickly, as though caught doing something he had not meant to reveal. Then his expression softened. "Couldn't sleep," he said. Margaret stepped closer. "You should have called me." "I'm fine." But he looked tired in a way that frightened her. On the desk lay scattered papers and an envelope she did not recognize, cream-colored and sealed. Daniel placed his hand over it before she could read the front. "What's that?" she asked. He held her gaze for several seconds. Then he said, very calmly, "Something I pray you won't need for a long time." A chill passed through her. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, sliding the envelope into the drawer, "that some truths arrive too early and ruin everything, and some arrive late enough to save what's left." Margaret stared at him, unsettled by the gravity in his voice. "Daniel." He crossed the room and took both her hands in his. His palms were rough, still marked by a lifetime of work. "If the day ever comes when this family stands on the edge of tearing itself apart," he said, "promise me you'll remember that this house did not survive by accident." She searched his face, but found only exhaustion and something deeper, something almost like sorrow. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't have to, tonight." Then he kissed her forehead, turned off the lamp, and guided her gently out of the room, leaving the study behind them in darkness, while the old house, with all its buried history, settled around them like a witness that had not yet spoken. If you've ever watched a family fall apart quietly instead of loudly, then you already know the hardest part is not the funeral. It is the week after, when the flowers begin to wilt, the casseroles stop arriving, and grief is forced to share the room with paperwork, resentment, and old ambitions people no longer bother to hide. Daniel Hale was buried on a gray Thursday beneath a low October sky that never fully decided whether it wanted to rain. By the time the service ended, Margaret felt as though she had aged 10 years in 3 days. She stood beside the grave in a black coat that no longer kept out the cold, and listened to the minister say words about rest, faith, and homecoming. The words floated around her without landing. What she felt was not peace. What she felt was absence so complete it seemed to alter the shape of the air itself. Victor stood on her left, tall and controlled, his dark overcoat pressed and expensive, his jaw set in the same polished expression he wore to corporate meetings and difficult negotiations. He had spoken well at the service, measured, respectful, almost moving. Elise, on Margaret's right, had cried beautifully, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth, as though grief itself were a performance she could not afford to mishandle. Noah stood a little apart from them all, his shoulders bent against the wind, his eyes fixed on the ground as the casket disappeared beneath flowers and damp earth. When it was over, people came in lines. Daniel's old co-workers, 2 retired neighbors, a couple from church Margaret had not seen in months, someone from Noah's childhood baseball team. Even the postman stopped to shake her hand with awkward gentleness. They all said some version of the same thing. He was a good man. He worked harder than anyone. He loved this family. Margaret nodded at every sentence because she could not yet trust her voice. At home, the house was too full of food and too empty of him. Elise moved through the kitchen, opening foil trays and arranging plates, as though order might defeat sorrow. Victor answered calls by the front window, lowering his voice each time Margaret came near. Noah carried chairs back from the dining room to the garage and avoided eye contact with everyone, especially his brother. The old clock above the mantel ticked on, indifferent and exact. By evening, the last guests were gone. The front door shut, silence settled. And that was when the real conversation began. Margaret was standing at the sink, rinsing coffee cups, when Victor entered the kitchen with the careful expression of a man about to introduce a subject he had already rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "sit down for a minute." She did not turn immediately. "I've been sitting down all day." "Please." There was something in his tone, not tenderness, not exactly, that made her dry her hands and take a seat at the kitchen table. Elise joined them a moment later, folding herself into the chair across from Margaret with the graceful weariness of someone exhausted but alert. Noah remained in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, as if he did not intend to stay but knew he would. Victor placed both hands flat on the table. "We need to talk practically." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The word itself stung. "Practically," she repeated. He exhaled. "I know this is terrible timing. I do. But there are things that can't wait too long. Property taxes, the condition of the house, insurance, maintenance. You shouldn't be handling all of that alone." Elise leaned in, her voice softer. He's right, Mom. This place is too much for one person now. It was already too much before. Margaret felt the old kitchen around her as though seeing it from a distance. The worn oak cabinets Daniel had refinished himself, the scratch on the far wall from when Victor had crashed a toy truck into it at age 4, the little stain near the window from a leak they could not afford to fix for nearly a year. Too much. Perhaps it was, but the speed of their reasoning felt indecent. "Your father was buried this afternoon," she said quietly. Elise's face tightened. "And that's exactly why we have to think ahead." Victor kept his voice even. "No one is trying to disrespect Dad, but the market in this area is still decent. If you wait too long, the value could drop. The roof needs work. The plumbing is old. Selling now would protect you." "Protect me?" Margaret said. "Yes." She studied him. "Or help you?" For the first time, irritation flickered across Victor's face. "That's unfair." From the doorway, Noah spoke, his voice low. "Is it?" Victor turned sharply. "I'm talking about reality." "No," Noah said. "You're talking about timing." Elise straightened in her chair. "Oh, please, don't start acting like you're above this. You agreed in the car that the house should probably be sold." Noah gave a humorless laugh. "I said maybe it would be easier for Mom. That's not the same as dragging in real estate logic before the flowers are dead." Victor rubbed his forehead. "This is exactly what I meant. No one wants to have an adult conversation." Margaret sat very still. The ache in her chest had not eased since the hospital. Now it deepened, but not from grief alone. She had known in some distant, unspoken way that this moment would come. The children had grown up under the roof, but not all of them had loved it. To Victor, it had always been a symbol of limitations. To Elise, something respectable only when properly presented. To Noah, perhaps something more complicated. A place where love had existed, yes, but also silence, pressure, and disappointments never fully explained. "What is it you all think this house is?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, Elise said, "An asset." The honesty of it landed like a slap. Margaret looked from one child to another. Victor did not correct his sister. Noah looked away, ashamed perhaps, but not surprised. That night, after they left, she wandered through the house unable to rest. Daniel's slippers were still beside the bed. His reading glasses still lay on the nightstand. The closet still smelled faintly of his aftershave and winter wool. Every ordinary object seemed almost cruel in its persistence. How could the world allow a man to vanish while keeping the indentation of his life so painfully intact? She paused outside the study door. For a long moment she could not bring herself to enter. The room had always carried Daniel's quiet authority. Even now, with him gone, it felt like stepping into a place where she ought to lower her voice. Inside, everything remained as he had left it. The desk lamp, the ledgers, the brass letter opener, a stack of bills held together by a rusting clip. She sat carefully in his chair and opened a drawer, then another, finding nothing but the usual contents of a life spent managing what little there had been: warranties, manuals, yellowed receipts, an old church bulletin tucked into a notebook. She almost stopped there. Then she remembered the night she had found him by the bookshelf, the cream-colored envelope, his hand covering it too quickly. Margaret rose and moved to the built-in shelves lining the wall. She ran her fingers across the wood, over dust and grooves and age. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, near the lower shelf, she felt a tiny unevenness beneath the trim. She pressed it. A narrow panel shifted. Her breath caught. Behind it lay a shallow compartment, hardly wider than a folded newspaper. Inside was the envelope. Cream-colored, sealed, her name written across the front in Daniel's careful handwriting. Margaret. Nothing else. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. The paper was older than she had expected, softened by time but still intact. On the back was a date, 18 years earlier. The year Noah had been injured. The year Victor had suddenly stopped asking Daniel for money. The year Elise, after months of unexplained panic, had somehow managed to remain in school despite whispers that she had been in serious trouble. Margaret sat back down, staring at the envelope as memories rearranged themselves inside her mind. That had been the hardest year of their marriage. Daniel had worked like a man trying to outrun disaster. He had become thinner, sharper, harder to reach. Bills had appeared, then disappeared. Phone calls had come late at night. Once she had found him in the basement holding his chest and insisting it was only indigestion. What had he hidden from her? Or perhaps worse, what had he hidden for all of them? She did not open the letter. Not yet. Instead, she placed it on the desk and covered it with both hands, as if steadying herself against a storm she could hear approaching. The next morning, Victor arrived with coffee, a legal pad, and the sort of brisk energy that belonged in an office rather than a morning house. Elise followed 30 minutes later with a folder and a sympathetic expression that vanished the moment she saw Margaret sitting at the dining room table with the envelope beside her. "What's that?" Elise asked. Margaret looked up. "Something your father left." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "For you?" "Yes." Noah came in last, empty-handed, his hair still damp from the rain outside. He noticed the tension immediately. "What happened?" Before Margaret could answer, a car pulled into the driveway. Victor glanced through the front window. "That'll be Karen." Margaret frowned. "Karen?" "The realtor," he said, as if the matter were obvious. "She's just coming to take a preliminary look. No obligation. I thought it would help to know what we're dealing with." For one astonishing second, she could not speak. "You brought a realtor here?" Victor spread his hands. "Only to get information." "Without asking me?" Elise interjected quickly. "Mom, please don't make this bigger than it is. We're trying to help." Noah stared at Victor in disbelief. "You actually did it." Victor's control cracked. Someone has to move things forward. The doorbell rang. Margaret rose slowly from her chair. The envelope remained in her hand. Something in her face changed then. Not dramatic, not loud, but firm enough that all 3 children fell silent. She walked to the front window, saw the woman waiting politely on the porch, then turned back to her children. For the first time since Daniel's death, her voice carried not grief, but decision. "You want to know what I'm going to do?" she said. Victor opened his mouth, but she continued before he could speak. "I will sell the house." All 3 of them froze. Even Noah blinked. Elise's expression shifted instantly from caution to relief. "Mom, that's—" Margaret lifted one hand. "I said I will sell it," she repeated, "but only after I open this letter, and only after I understand why your father hid it for 18 years. No one moved. The bell rang again, distant and insistent. Margaret held the envelope against her chest, looked at the front door, and then at the 3 adults she had once carried through fevers, schoolyard humiliations, broken hearts, and hungry winters. For the first time in years, she felt not like the weakest person in the room, but the only one standing in the right place. "Until then," she said, "no one decides anything." If you have ever sat in a room where one sheet of paper held enough truth to rearrange an entire family, then you already know how strange silence can become. It no longer feels empty. It feels crowded by fear, memory, guilt, and the terrible suspicion that once the words are spoken aloud, no one in the room will be able to return to the version of themselves they walked in with. The realtor did not come inside. Margaret opened the front door only a few inches and spoke to the woman in a voice so steady that even she hardly recognized it. "I'm sorry, but this is not a good time. There will be no viewing today." The woman, polished and sympathetic, gave a small nod. "Of course, I understand. Mr. Hale said this was only preliminary." Margaret's expression did not change. "There will be nothing preliminary until I say so." When she closed the door, the house seemed to hold its breath. Victor stood by the fireplace with both hands in his coat pockets, his face set in the rigid patience he used when trying not to lose his temper in public. Elise sat on the edge of the sofa, one knee bouncing faintly, watching Margaret with a nervousness she was trying to disguise as composure. Noah remained near the dining room archway, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the envelope in Margaret's hands, as though it might already be burning. Margaret did not sit immediately. She walked back into the dining room, pulled out Daniel's chair at the head of the table, and then stopped herself. Her fingers rested on the wood for a second before she moved to her own seat instead. The envelope looked older in daylight. Its cream paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and the ink of Daniel's handwriting had softened with time. But there it was all the same, her name written with that careful firmness she could have recognized anywhere. She ran her thumb lightly along the seal. 18 years. What sort of truth waited almost 2 decades in darkness? Elise finally spoke. "Mum, are you really going to read it now?" Margaret looked up. "Yes." Victor exhaled through his nose. "Privately would make more sense." "Why?" Noah said at once. "Afraid of what it says?" Victor turned sharply toward him. "Don't start." "No, answer him," Margaret said, surprising all of them. "Why privately?" Victor's jaw tightened. "Because Dad wrote it to you." Margaret kept her eyes on him. "And yet your father hid it during the very year all 3 of you nearly tore this family apart in ways I never fully understood. If this letter concerns only me, then you have nothing to worry about. If it concerns more than me, then perhaps it is long past time all of us heard it." Noah lowered his gaze. Elise swallowed. Margaret reached for the silver letter opener that still sat in the small dish on the sideboard. Daniel had once joked that it made him look like a man important enough to receive dangerous correspondence. She remembered laughing at that. Now the memory hit her with such force, she had to steady her hand before sliding the blade under the seal. The paper gave way with a soft tear. Inside was a folded set of pages, more than she expected. Daniel had written on both sides in neat, deliberate lines. The sight of his handwriting alone nearly undid her. For a moment she could not read. She pressed her lips together, drew in a careful breath, and began. "My Margaret, if you are opening this, then one of 2 things has happened. Either I am gone, or the family is standing at the edge of something I spent years trying to prevent. If it is the second, forgive me for not being braver sooner. If it is the first, forgive me for leaving you with a burden that should have been mine to carry." Her voice faltered slightly, but she continued. "I have hidden this letter because truth, told at the wrong time, can destroy people before it changes them. But lies, especially the lies of silence, rot a house from the inside. I know that now, and I know I have asked too much of you for too long." Margaret stopped there, blinking hard. Across the table, Noah had gone still as stone. Elise's face was pale. Victor looked toward the window as though refusing to let the words land fully. Margaret read on. 18 years ago, this family nearly lost everything, not because of bad luck alone, and not because the world was unfair, though it often was. We nearly lost everything because each of our children, in different ways, stood on the edge of ruin at the same time, and I chose to keep it from you, believing I could save them all without breaking your heart. I was wrong about many things, but not about this. You deserved the truth." She lowered the first page into her lap. A sound escaped Elise, faint and involuntary. "What does that mean?" Margaret did not answer. She turned to the next page. "Victor came to me first. He was 24, proud as the devil and twice as determined not to fail. He had made choices in business that were beyond his means and beneath his honesty. He did not tell you because he knew you would be ashamed, and he did not tell his siblings because he feared looking weak. By the time he came to me, legal action was close, and one signature in the wrong office would have followed him for years. I paid what he owed, not with savings because we did not have enough, but by borrowing against the house. Victor lifted his head so fast the chair legs scraped behind him. "That's not—" He stopped. Margaret looked up from the letter. "What?" Victor's face had lost color. "I paid you back." Daniel's words waited patiently on the page, more convincing than any denial. Margaret read on. "Not long after that, Elise came to me. She was too frightened to look me in the eye. Someone had lured her into debt she could not manage, and she had been pretending for months that everything was under control while the pressure hollowed her out from the inside. She begged me not to tell you because she said you had already given up too much for her, and she could not bear to watch disappointment settle on your face." Elise put one hand over her mouth. Margaret stared at the page, but what she saw was her daughter at 22, beautiful, volatile, tearful in strange bursts, insisting she was merely stressed while spending long hours shut in her bedroom whenever she visited. There were mysterious phone calls, a withdrawn stiffness around money. Daniel had told Margaret not to worry, that it was young adult mess, nothing more.
"Nothing more." Elise whispered, "I was going to fix it." Victor gave a bitter laugh. "You always say that after the wreckage." "Don't," Noah muttered. Margaret kept reading. And then there was Noah. His trouble was not like the others, though it cost us all the same. After the accident, he needed treatment and months more care than insurance would cover. He tried to act as though pain was something he could outrun. When he realized what the bills were doing, he talked of quitting school, taking whatever job he could, disappearing if that's what it took to stop costing us money. I would not allow it. Noah looked as though the room had tilted beneath him. Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered that year with sudden, awful clarity now. Noah had come home after the accident quieter than ever, his arm healing badly, his pride worse. Daniel had become harsher with him then, or so it had seemed. Arguments had begun over school, responsibility, discipline. Margaret had believed father and son were merely growing apart under strain. She had not understood what deeper current had been dragging them both under. She continued, "To keep the house, save Victor from public disgrace, free Elise from debt, and pay for Noah's care, I refinanced this home and burned through whatever future I had imagined for us. Retirement was gone, the savings were gone, my health went with them little by little. I do not write that to ask for praise. I write it because if they ever stand in that living room speaking of this house as though it appeared by habit or belongs to them by default, they must first understand what it cost." Silence swept through the room like cold water. Victor spoke first, but his voice no longer sounded polished. It sounded young, defensive, exposed. "You should have said no." Margaret lifted her eyes from the page. He laughed, once, harshly, at himself more than anyone. "That's what you're all thinking, isn't it? That I went to him and took what I wanted." Noah answered before Margaret could. Didn't you? Victor rounded on him. I was trying to build something. With Dad's lungs and Mom's house as collateral, Noah said. Elise rose abruptly from the sofa. Stop it! None of you get to act innocent. None of us knew how bad it was for the others. Victor looked at her. You knew enough about your own mess. And you knew enough about yours. Margaret's voice, when it came, was quiet. Sit down. They obeyed. She turned the page. If I failed, it was not only by hiding these things. I failed because I let pride rule the house where honesty should have lived. I thought sacrifice alone could keep a family decent. I was wrong. Sacrifice without truth turns to bitterness. Love without accountability turns children entitled. Silence makes cowards of everyone. Margaret felt the force of those lines in her bones. Daniel had not written like this in ordinary life. He had spoken in fragments, in practicalities, in work orders and weather talk and tired jokes over supper. But here, on these pages, was the man beneath all that restraint, the one who had spent years watching, absorbing, calculating, and mourning the shape his family had taken. Then came the paragraph that changed everything. So hear me clearly, Margaret, this house must never be sold for their convenience, their impatience, or their greed. If the day comes when they treat you as an obstacle between themselves and what they think is theirs, do not reward them. Do not surrender the one thing bought by your youth, your labor, and your tenderness. Use it instead to rebuild your own life. And if there is one among them, or beyond them, who shows loyalty without asking what it pays, then let that person receive what the others mistook for an entitlement.
Margaret lowered the letter slowly. The room had gone utterly still. Elise was crying now, but not gracefully, not beautifully. The kind of crying that strips polish from a face and leaves only a frightened daughter beneath. Noah had one hand pressed against his mouth, his eyes wet and fixed on the grain of the table. Victor looked like a man who had just discovered the ground he stood on was not ground at all, but debt layered over sacrifice. Margaret read the final section. I know this letter may wound them. Perhaps it should. But I do not want pain to be the end of this story. I want it to be the beginning of honesty, if honesty can still be born in this family. As for you, my Margaret, if I have left you with anything worth keeping, let it be this. You have spent too much of your life preserving everyone else. If you are alone when you read this, or if they have already begun pressing you toward decisions that make your grief smaller than their plans, then stop. Stand still, look closely, and choose yourself for once. With all the love I knew how to give, Daniel. When she finished, Margaret did not immediately fold the pages. She sat with them spread before her, Daniel's final truth visible in ink and trembling light. For years she had told herself that the shape of their family was simply the shape life had made. Some children hardened, some withdrew. Some performed strength because they did not know how else to survive. She had accepted the strain, the distance, the unspoken resentments as though they were weather. Now she saw that beneath the weather had been architecture, choices, concealments, sacrifices no one had named. Elise spoke first, barely above a whisper. He should have told me no. Margaret turned to her daughter. Elise shook her head, tears falling faster now. I mean it. I kept thinking I could solve it before anyone found out. I thought if Dad helped me once, I'd fix everything and no one would have to know. But I never really fixed anything, did I? I just learned how to hide panic better. Margaret said nothing. Noah finally looked up. That year, he swallowed hard. I thought Dad was angry at me. Every time a bill came, every time school came up, every time he told me to stop apologizing and just focus on recovering, I thought he resented me. I thought I ruined everything. Margaret's chest tightened painfully. Oh, Noah. He let out a broken laugh. And I hated him for it sometimes. God help me, I did. Victor remained standing by the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel. I did pay some of it back, he said, but there was no arrogance left in the statement, only shame and the useless instinct to defend a younger self. Not enough, obviously, not then, but I thought once I got established, I'd make it all worth it. For whom? Noah asked. Victor closed his eyes. No one answered. After a long silence, Margaret rose from the table. She gathered the pages carefully, squared them, and slid them back into the envelope, not to hide them again, but to preserve them. Then she carried the envelope into the living room and placed it on the mantel beneath the family photographs, where no one could pretend it did not exist. When she turned back to her children, something in her had changed. The grief was still there, the exhaustion too, but beneath both was a new steadiness, one Daniel had asked of her, and perhaps known she was capable of long before she believed it herself. There will be no sale. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. No realtor, no listing, no paperwork, no conversations behind my back. Not now, not next week, not until I decide what becomes of this house. Elise wiped her face. Mom. Margaret looked directly at her. Your father did not preserve this home so that the first thing done after his funeral would be to turn it into a transaction.
She turned to Victor. And I will not spend what remains of my life being managed. Then to Noah. And none of you will carry on believing you understand the whole story when clearly you never did. The old clock on the mantel ticked once, twice. Outside, late afternoon light settled over the yard Daniel had mowed for decades. Margaret felt the pull of habit urging her to soften, to comfort, to say something that would make the room easier to bear. For most of her life, that had been her role, to absorb tension before it spread, to patch over damage before it became visible. But Daniel's letter had stripped that option away. Easy was what had brought them here. So instead, she said the truest thing she had said in years. For the first time, she told them, I am going to find out what my life looks like if I stop living it around everybody else's emergencies. There is a particular kind of mourning that comes after a family truth has finally been spoken aloud. The furniture is the same. The walls have not moved. The same plates sit in the cupboard. The same floorboards creak. The same mailbox stands at the curb. And yet nothing is the same, because the lie that once held everything in its familiar shape is gone. What remains is not peace, not yet, but a raw and unfamiliar honesty that makes every person in the room stand differently in their own skin. For Margaret Hale, that morning arrived with frost along the front window and the sound of no one else breathing in the house but her. It had been 3 days since she read Daniel's letter aloud. Victor had left first that evening, muttering something about needing time. Elise had followed 30 minutes later, red-eyed and trembling with wounded pride. Noah had remained the longest, sitting in the kitchen long after darkness fell, staring into a mug of coffee that had gone cold. He had looked as if he wanted to say 100 things and could not manage a single one. In the end, he had only stood by the back door and asked, Do you want me to come by tomorrow? Margaret had studied his face. Her youngest son had always looked the most like no one but himself. Not Daniel's jaw, not her eyes exactly, but some softer mixture of both. The strain in him seemed older now, less like immaturity and more like a habit of carrying disappointment for too long. Yes, she had said, come by tomorrow. So he did.
He arrived just after 9 wearing an old canvas jacket and carrying a toolbox Margaret had not seen in years. She opened the door before he knocked a second time. "What's that?" He lifted the box slightly. "The back gutter is loose. I noticed it last week." Margaret looked at him for a moment. "You noticed it last week?" He gave a faint shrug. "I just notice things. I just haven't always done anything about them." That answer followed her all day. Noah worked quietly, without trying to explain himself into goodness. He climbed the ladder, checked the gutter, tightened what needed tightening, and then moved on to the porch rail that had gone wobbly sometime during Daniel's last winter. When Margaret brought him soup at lunchtime, he accepted it with a nod and sat on the back steps to eat, looking out over the yard where the grass had begun to fade into the color of old straw. After a while, he said, "I didn't know he refinanced the house." Margaret sat beside him, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. "Neither did I." He stirred the spoon in the bowl without taking another bite. "He's been thinking about that year, about how he kept pushing me to go back to school, how angry he got when I said I should quit and work. I thought he was ashamed of me for getting hurt. That's what I told myself." He let out a bitter little laugh. "Turns out he was trying to keep me from sacrificing myself because he'd already decided to sacrifice himself first."
Margaret looked at the dying garden, at the patch of earth where Daniel had once tried and failed to grow tomatoes 3 summers in a row because he was too stubborn to accept that the soil near the fence was wrong. "He loved you," she said quietly. Noah nodded, but his eyes remained fixed ahead. "I know that now, but knowing it late doesn't erase what I did with not knowing it back then." Margaret did not answer. Some griefs were not improved by quick comfort. By the end of that week, Noah had repaired the gutter, fixed a cabinet hinge in the kitchen, replaced 2 porch bulbs, and gone through half the boxes in Daniel's study, sorting receipts, warranties, and decades of bank papers into careful stacks. He did not pry into anything personal, he simply helped. And because he did it without speeches, Margaret found herself trusting the change more than she would have trusted remorse dressed in grand declarations. Victor's approach was different. He called first. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped but controlled, "I'd like to come by and talk." Margaret stood at the telephone table in the hallway where she had once taken school calls, emergency calls, and late-night calls from children who only remembered their parents when trouble had become too large to hide. "Talk," she repeated. "Yes. What about?" A brief silence. "About the letter." She considered refusing. Instead, she said, "Come tomorrow at 4. Victor arrived exactly on time, carrying a bottle of expensive olive oil and a bakery box, as if gifts might soften the fact of him. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. Success had always suited him too smoothly. This weariness made him look closer to the boy who once sat at the kitchen table doing algebra with clenched teeth, furious at every problem he could not solve on the first try. He stood in the living room instead of sitting. "I was angry." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I know. I'm still angry, in some ways. That I also know." He gave a short breath that was not quite a laugh. "At Dad, mostly." Margaret raised her eyes. Victor paced once, then stopped by the bookshelf. "He could have told me what it cost him. He could have thrown it in my face. He could have said, 'You did this, now look at me.' But he didn't. He just let me build my life thinking I'd solved my own mistakes." His expression hardened, though now the hardness was aimed inward. "Do you understand what that does to a person?" Margaret's reply came gently, but not weakly. "It depends on the person."
He absorbed that. Then, more quietly, he said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me today." "That's wise." He almost smiled, then lost it. "I came because I don't know how to stand in this house anymore and pretend I earned my footing." Margaret rose and crossed the room slowly. For the first time in years, she did not feel small beside her eldest son. "You start by not treating repentance like another business plan." Victor lowered his head. "Fair." She let the silence stretch a moment before adding, "Your father was wrong to hide it all, but don't make his secrecy into an excuse for what you became afterward. Whatever he paid for you bought you a second chance, Victor. The problem is that you spent years acting as though it was your first success."
He looked at her then, properly looked at her, and something in his face shifted, painfully, reluctantly, but unmistakably. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was listening to her not as his mother in the background of his life, but as a person whose judgment might matter. Elise did not come so easily. A week passed, then another. She sent flowers once, then a text that read, "I need time to think." Margaret did not answer either. She was learning, slowly and with some astonishment, that not every silence needed to be filled by her. Instead, her days began to take on a shape she had not anticipated. At first, it was practical. She met with a financial advisor Daniel had once mentioned but never had time to visit with her. She reviewed the mortgage documents, the refinance history, the insurance papers. Sitting in a small office with a man young enough to be her son, Margaret expected to feel embarrassed by how little she knew. Instead, she felt angry, quietly, steadily angry, at how long she had lived inside the mechanics of a family without ever being handed the full blueprint. By the third meeting, that anger had become something more useful: resolve. One rainy afternoon, she stood in the downstairs guest room, really Daniel's overflow room for boxes, old lamps, and things no one wanted to throw away, and thought, with sudden clarity, that the house had spent too many years storing pain and deferred decisions. She was tired of it being a museum to sacrifice. She wanted it to become useful again. The idea arrived not as a grand vision, but as a memory. Many years earlier, when Victor was small and Elise still slept with a stuffed rabbit under her arm, a woman from church had appeared at their door with a split lip and nowhere to go for the night. Margaret had let her in without question. The woman had stayed on the sofa for 2 days, then left with a borrowed coat and a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Daniel had said little about it then, but later that night he had told her, "A house is not worth much if it only shelters the people who already belong there." Now, standing in that dusty room, Margaret heard the sentence as though he had just spoken it. The following week, she visited a local community outreach center downtown. The building smelled faintly of coffee, old paperwork, and winter coats drying near radiators. A woman named Teresa, brisk and kind-faced, showed her around and explained the center's work with women leaving unstable housing, older widows facing sudden financial collapse, and people who simply needed a temporary room while getting back on their feet. Margaret listened more than she spoke. At the end of the visit, Teresa asked, "What made you come in?" Margaret looked at the stack of intake folders on the desk, then out the window where buses passed in the thin November light. "My husband died, and after that I realized I'd spent most of my life preserving a house without asking what it might be for besides memory." Teresa tilted her head slightly. "That's a powerful realization." Margaret gave a small, humorless smile. It felt more like being struck by it. By December, the idea had begun to take form.
Not a shelter in the official sense, not something beyond her means, but perhaps 1 or 2 rooms, short-term refuge, a place for a woman between disasters, a room for someone who needed several weeks to breathe before choosing what came next. When she mentioned it to Noah, he did not tell her it was impractical. He set down the hammer he had been using to repair a loose piece of molding and asked, "Which room were you thinking?" Margaret blinked. "You're not going to argue with me?" He gave her a tired smile. "Mom, after the last month, I'm done assuming I know which of your ideas are impossible."
So, together, they began with the front guest room and the old sewing room upstairs. They emptied closets, sorted linens, discarded broken furniture, and washed windows that had not been properly cleaned in years. Dust rose in clouds. Old memories surfaced in objects. A jar of buttons from Margaret's mending days. A yellowing invitation from Elise's college fundraiser. One of Noah's school notebooks filled with sketches instead of math work. Through it all, the house slowly changed. It no longer felt like a place waiting to be taken from her. It felt like a place becoming hers. At the same time, Margaret stepped into other parts of life she had long abandoned. She returned to the public library and signed up to volunteer with the literacy program twice a week. She joined a small continuing education class at the community center on local history and oral storytelling, laughing at herself the first evening as she sat among strangers with a notebook in her lap like a schoolgirl. She even began taking morning walks farther than the corner and back, learning the winter faces of neighbors she had once known only through waving across lawns. One afternoon, after class, she stood outside the library in her coat and gloves, with a paper cup warming her hands, and felt an emotion so unfamiliar she had to stand still and name it. Anticipation. Not duty, not endurance, not relief at surviving another day. Anticipation. When Elise finally appeared, it was just before Christmas, and she did not come alone. She arrived with a lawyer. Margaret saw the sedan in the driveway and knew at once that this was not a daughter's visit. Elise entered the house looking impeccable in a camel-colored coat, a leather folder tucked against her chest, while the man beside her wore the bland expression of someone who billed by the hour and wished to remain personally invisible. Noah was in the dining room sorting nails and hardware into labeled tins. He stood the moment he saw them. "What is this?" he asked. Elise's chin lifted. A formal conversation. Margaret came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "About what?" Elise's voice was steady, though her eyes were not. "About the estate, about the property, about making sure decisions are being made appropriately while you're grieving." For one stunned moment, the room seemed to fall backward in time, back into every season when Margaret had minimized, excused, and absorbed what should have been confronted. Noah took a step forward. "You brought a lawyer into this house?" Elise snapped before she could stop herself. "Someone has to protect what belongs to all of us." The silence that followed was total. Margaret folded the towel once, neatly, and placed it on the sideboard. Then she looked at her daughter, not with outrage, not even with visible hurt, but with the terrible calm of a woman who had finally run out of excuses to make on behalf of other people's selfishness. What belongs to all of you is the opportunity to decide who you are after learning the truth. This house does not belong to your impatience. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, my client is only asking for clarification regarding future disposition of a family asset." Margaret turned to him with such quiet authority that he stopped mid-sentence. "My husband's letter is documented. The financial records are documented. The title is in order. If your client wishes to challenge my right to live,
decide and act within my own home, she is welcome to waste her money doing so, but she will not frighten me into surrender." Elise stared at her, and for the first time Margaret saw not entitlement, but shock, real shock, the kind that comes when a person raised on someone else's softness discovers it has ended. "You'd speak to me like this?" Elise whispered. Margaret answered without cruelty, "I should have years ago."
Noah said nothing. He did not need to. The lawyer, sensing both futility and humiliation, muttered something about returning at a better time and retreated toward the door. Elise stood frozen for another second, her face burning with anger and wounded pride, then followed him out without another word. When the door shut, the house did not feel broken. It felt defended. Margaret stood in the silence afterward, breathing steadily. Her hands were trembling only slightly. Noah looked at her with something like awe. "Mom." She let out one long breath and sat down at the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said, half to herself, "I think that may have been the first time in my life I chose not to be afraid of making my own child unhappy." Noah pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "How does it feel?" Margaret looked toward the hallway, toward the old rooms changing shape one by one, toward the mantel where Daniel's letter now stood framed behind glass. Strange, she thought. Painful. Necessary. And then, with the faintest trace of a smile, she said, "Like I might finally become the woman your father always suspected I was, if everyone else would stop standing in the doorway." There are some houses that spend years holding grief like dampness in the walls. Then, one day, almost without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, the same rooms begin to hold something else. Not innocence, because innocence once lost does not return. Not perfection, because families are never remade that neatly. But usefulness, truth, a different kind of love. And when that happens, the house is no longer a monument to what was suffered there. It becomes proof that suffering did not have the final word. By the second anniversary of Daniel Hale's death, people in the neighborhood had stopped referring to the old place on Maple Crescent as the widow's house. They called it Hale House. The name had not been painted on a sign with any ceremony. It began with Teresa from the Outreach Center, who mentioned it that way over the phone one afternoon. Then a church volunteer repeated it. Then a woman from the library used the phrase when asking Margaret whether the spare upstairs room was still available for a temporary resident in transition. Slowly, naturally, the name settled into place, as though the house had been waiting years to become itself. The changes were visible even from the street. Noah had repaired the front gate in spring and repainted the porch rail by summer. The front shutters, once peeling and dull, were now calm, deep blue. Window boxes held hardy flowers in the warmer months, and in winter, small white lights framed the porch, without looking festive enough to seem careless about the work being done inside. The lawn was no longer perfect, but it was alive. So was the house. Margaret was alive inside it, too. At 70, she no longer moved quickly, but she moved with intention. Her days had shape now. On Mondays and Thursdays, she worked with the literacy program at the library, where she discovered she still had the patient soul of the teacher she had once dreamed of becoming. On Tuesdays, she coordinated with Teresa about temporary guests and practical needs. Wednesdays were for errands, paperwork, and the business of running the charitable trust she had begun forming in Daniel's name. On Fridays, she left the afternoon open, telling herself that a life fully reclaimed ought to contain at least one piece of unassigned time. She no longer apologized for taking up space in her own calendar. The house had sheltered several people over the past 2 years, none of them permanently, all of them memorable. A widow named Jean had stayed for 6 weeks after her landlord sold the building she had lived in for 21 years. A young mother named Pilar had spent a winter there while waiting for safe housing after leaving a relationship that had hollowed her out. An elderly couple, Arthur and Doreen, had occupied the downstairs room for 3 months when Arthur's surgery and mounting bills forced them out of their apartment. Margaret learned quickly that refuge did not have to be grand to be life-changing.
Sometimes it was simply a warm room, a kettle always left full, and the absence of cruelty. Your husband must have been a good man.
Jean said once over tea, glancing at Daniel's framed photograph on the mantel. Margaret looked at the image. Daniel, in his late 50s, not smiling broadly, but with that unmistakable steadiness in his eyes. He was a complicated man, she said, but yes, good where it counted. That, she had decided, was the truest way to remember him. Noah became part of the daily life of the house without ever trying to claim ownership of it. He did not move in, though Margaret suspected part of him wanted to. Instead, he rented a small apartment 10 minutes away and came by so often that his presence felt woven into the rhythm of things. He handled repairs, carried groceries, fixed the upstairs radiator twice in one winter, and once spent an entire Saturday building simple shelves for the pantry because Margaret had mentioned, only once, that she was tired of canned goods toppling over each other. What moved her most was not that he helped, but how. He did not announce it. He did not perform it. He had changed in the slow, unglamorous way real people change, through repetition, humility, and the willingness to keep showing up after the dramatic moment has passed. One chilly March afternoon, while they sorted donated blankets in the dining room, Margaret said, "Your father would have liked this version of you." Noah kept folding for a few seconds before answering. "I'm not sure." Margaret gave him a look. He sighed. "I know he would have appreciated the work. I just don't know whether I earned the right to imagine him proud." Margaret set down the stack in her hands. "Noah." He looked up. "You are still thinking of your life as a courtroom. Your father is not waiting to sentence you. He loved you. That didn't end because you misunderstood him when you were hurting and young." Noah's face tightened with emotion he still did not wear easily. "He left you a second chance, too," she said, "not just Victor and Elise. Don't insult his sacrifice by wasting yours on permanent guilt." That sentence stayed with him. She knew because after that day, the heaviness in him seemed to shift, not disappear, but redistribute itself into something more livable. Victor's return to the family was slower, more awkward, and in some ways more surprising. For months after Daniel's letter, he came and went in careful intervals, never staying long, never asking for absolution. He had listened, finally, when Margaret told him that remorse was not an announcement, but a practice, so he practiced. He began by sending a contractor, at his own expense and without fanfare, to inspect the aging plumbing after a pipe threatened to burst in the upstairs bathroom. When Margaret confronted him, "Did you arrange this?" he merely said, "Yes, you could have refused him." She had not refused. Later, he came by on a rainy Sunday and repaired a broken latch on the cellar door with his own hands, ruining a pair of expensive shoes in the mud without once mentioning it. Another time, he dropped off a stack of office chairs from a company renovation, saying only, "These were being discarded. I thought you might use them for the pantry." Margaret watched all of this carefully. One evening in early summer, he stayed after Noah had left and stood in the kitchen while she washed up supper dishes. "I loved this house as an asset," he said abruptly. "That's the ugliest truth I know about myself." Margaret did not turn around immediately. "Because?" He leaned both hands on the counter. "Because numbers were easier than memory. If it was an asset, then I could talk about value without talking about what Dad and you actually spent to keep it standing. If it was property, then I didn't have to admit I'd built part of my life by forgetting where the foundation came from." She set down the plate she was drying and faced him. Victor looked older now, not in the ordinary way people age, but in the way shame can remove a layer of artificial youth from a face. Yet there was something almost peaceful about it too, less polished, more real. "What do you want from me?" Margaret asked. He answered without hesitation,
A place in your life that I don't purchase and don't inherit. Just a place I earn, if I still can. Margaret studied him for a long time. Then she nodded once. That, she said, is the first wise thing you've asked for in years. If Victor's transformation was slow, Elise's collapse came all at once. It happened in late autumn, almost 2 full years after Daniel's death. Margaret had not seen her youngest daughter in nearly 4 months, though there had been occasional stilted messages, none of them warm. Then, one Thursday evening, as rain lashed the windows and the wind rattled the porch light, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door and found Elise standing there alone. For a second, she did not recognize her. Not because Elise looked older, though she did, not because she was dressed poorly, though the coat she wore was wrinkled and rain-soaked and clearly thrown on in haste. Margaret did not recognize her because the expression on her daughter's face had been missing for most of her adult life. There was no performance in it, no social polish, no defensive brightness, no elegant misery curated for sympathy. Only defeat. "Elise," Margaret said softly. Her daughter's lower lip trembled once, then steadied. "I didn't know where else to go." Margaret stepped aside immediately. "Come in." Elise crossed the threshold like someone entering a church after years away. They sat in the kitchen while Margaret made tea. Only when the mug was in her hands did Elise begin to speak. The story came out in fragments at first, then in a rush. The man she had been seeing had left. Her so-called friends had vanished the moment scandal brushed near. A financial scheme she had trusted had failed. The apartment lease was gone. Her carefully arranged world, so dependent on appearances, access, and people who admired surfaces, had caved inward in a matter of weeks. "I know what this looks like," Elise whispered. "I know you'll think I only came because I've got nowhere else." Margaret sat across from her and answered honestly. "You did come because you've got nowhere else." Elise closed her eyes as if bracing for impact. "But that doesn't mean the door was wrong to open," Margaret said. Tears spilled down Elise's face then, sudden and uncontrollable. "I don't know how to be in a room where I'm not the one arranging everything." "You begin," Margaret said, "by being honest in it." Elise stayed, but Margaret did not make the mistake of rescuing her daughter into comfort without responsibility. Shelter, yes. Control, no. Elise was given the small upstairs room overlooking the side yard, a set of clean towels, and 3 clear expectations. She would contribute to the running of the house, she would not speak to the residents as though she were above them, and she would not use hardship as a costume. The first week was rough. Elise recoiled at practical tasks she once considered beneath her. She over-explained herself. She cried when Arthur accidentally criticized how she folded the laundry. She flinched when Jean, now back as a volunteer visitor, asked her bluntly, "So, are you here to heal or just to hide?" But little by little the performance cracked in useful ways. Margaret caught her one afternoon sitting at the kitchen table with Pilar's young son, helping him sound out words from a library book. Another time she found Elise in the pantry reorganizing canned food without being asked. Once, late at night, Margaret overheard her daughter apologizing to Doreen for speaking sharply, and meaning it. It was not redemption in a dramatic burst, it was something better. It was change. On the 2nd anniversary of Daniel's death, Margaret invited all 3 of her children to dinner. The air carried the first cold edge of winter. Inside, the dining room glowed with lamplight and the smell of rosemary chicken. The table was set simply but carefully, the good plates out, Daniel's old water glasses polished, the framed letter still visible from the mantel in the next room. Victor arrived early and helped Noah bring in extra chairs.
Elise came down from upstairs wearing a plain navy dress and no visible armor besides a tense smile that disappeared the moment Margaret squeezed her hand. They ate quietly at first, then stories began to surface, small ones, surprisingly gentle ones. Victor recalled the year Daniel tried to install a ceiling fan and wired it backward. Noah remembered the camping trip ruined by rain when Daniel insisted sleeping in the car built character.
Even Elise laughed when Margaret described Daniel's tragic tomato-growing efforts. For a brief, aching moment, the family was not healed exactly, but honest enough to sit in the same light without pretending. After dessert, Margaret stood. The room settled at once. She carried a folder from the sideboard and remained at the head of the table, not in Daniel's place, but fully in her own. "There is something I want all of you to hear together," she said. Victor sat straighter. Noah grew still. Elise clasped her hands in her lap. Margaret opened the folder. "I have completed the legal structure for this house and the property attached to it. Effective upon my death, it will not be sold and it will not be divided among you. The house will become a permanent charitable trust under the name Daniel Hale House, dedicated to temporary housing and community support for those in need." No one spoke. Margaret continued calmly. "This home caused too much suffering to become one more object people fight over. It has done more good in the last 2 years than it did in the decade before your father died. That will continue." She turned a page. "My personal savings, modest as they are, and my remaining assets outside the property will be distributed separately, not equally by habit, but thoughtfully, according to what each of you has shown me since the truth came out." Elise's eyes filled, but she did not interrupt. "Victor," she said, looking directly at him, "you tried to treat repentance like strategy. Then slowly you stopped. You learned how to help without controlling, and how to return without claiming. That matters." Victor swallowed hard. "Noah," she said, "you came back not with speeches, but with nails, tools, time, and patience. You have helped carry this house into its next life." Noah lowered his gaze. "Elise," Margaret said at last, and her daughter's face crumpled even before the words came. "You hurt me deeply, but when life stripped away what you hid behind, you stayed, you worked, you listened, and you have begun at last to become honest." Tears ran openly down Elise's cheeks. Margaret closed the folder. "This is my final choice, not against any of you, for something larger than all of us. Your father gave me a last chance to choose what this house would mean. I am choosing that it will outlive our worst instincts." The silence afterward was not empty. It was full, of loss, yes, but also of recognition. Then Victor rose first and crossed the room to kiss Margaret on the cheek. Noah followed, wrapping his arms around her with the same quiet intensity he had carried since boyhood. Elise came last, kneeling beside Margaret's chair and pressing her forehead to her mother's hand, as though surrender and gratitude had finally become the same thing. Later, when the dishes were done and the house had gone still, Margaret stepped onto the porch alone. The sunset stretched low and amber over the street. In the yard, Noah was helping Arthur carry a box from the car. Victor stood by the front gate with a toolbox, adjusting the hinge one more time even though it probably did not need adjusting. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see Elise drying teacups while Doreen spoke to her from the table. For years, Margaret believed the house was the inheritance. Now she understood. The house had only ever been the test. The real inheritance was the chance, late,
painful, undeserved in some ways, but real, to become people worthy of the sacrifices that had kept them sheltered all along. She looked up at the evening sky and thought of Daniel, not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as the flawed, stubborn, loving man who had hidden the truth too long and still somehow left behind the key to freedom. Then Margaret Hale turned back toward the warm light inside, toward the life she had finally chosen, and walked into the house that no longer belonged to grief.